All right. Hi, everyone. This talk is going to be about love and about queer love, but with a little bit of a Desi South Asian twist to it. And with all Desi stories, it starts with a little bit of tragedy, right? I discovered in my early teenage years that I was queer. This was in Delhi in the 90s. It was a criminal offense to be queer. And my circumstances obviously made it a little bit more challenging because I was born in a military family, which was a very hyper-masculine environment. I went to an all-boys school. It's like my parents didn't even give me a chance. And it was a lonely, scary, terrifying time to be all of 12, 13 years old and realize that someone had made a terrible mistake, made me a certain way, and made the rest of the world in a different way. And if I knew that there was a part of me that was responsible for my orientation, I would have ripped it out of my system and thrown it far away from me because there was that much shame and stigma and ridicule all around me. And this is a familiar story in so many parts of the world. But as in any Bollywood cheesy story, and as Giles just said, my way out of that period of shame was love, because love is always the answer. When I met the love of my life, Kotia, who's sitting right there, the most good-looking man in the room in the corner, and everything changed. I found my self-esteem back. I found self-confidence. I didn't care if the world didn't accept me or might ostracize me or disown me. The fact that I had Kotia was more than enough. This was 18 years ago. We've been together forever and ever, and it's been the best thing about my life. And as Imran mentioned, a couple of years ago, we decided, since we are very privileged, come from very privileged sections of Indian society, decided to petition the Indian Supreme Court to try to legalize, to get marriage equality in India. Not same-sex marriage, because it's much more about just marriage between the same sexes. It's marriage for transgender persons, for non-binary persons, marriage equality for everyone. And this presentation, therefore, is a little bit about what we learned from our little experience with advocacy in the field, about not just the queer rights movement, but about social change in general, that we try to talk about, and the mistakes we made and how to sort of correct some of these things. The first is grounding any attempt to change in the roots of the community where you want to have these conversations. Because as a lawyer, I'm trained to talk about fundamental rights, universal human rights, not realizing that that language actually sounds very westernized and actually is fuel to our opponents, because the easiest way to delegitimize the queer rights movement is to say, this is a Western corruption. This is a foreign import that's going to destabilize our society and our civilization. And also, why do that when our history is so replete with numerous instances, experiences of queer love? You go to temples in India, and the walls of these temples around the sanctum sanctorum are adorned with statues depicting queer love, whether it's transgender love or same-sex love. These are sculptures from the Khajuraho temple, and you can let your imagination run wild. Think of orgies, oral sex, whatever you want to think about, and I promise you it's captured on the wall of an ancient temple somewhere in India. You've obviously heard of the Kama Sutra, a text, a religious text, which tells a Hindu how to lead a good life, and one of its primary objectives is the achievement of desire. Pre-colonized society, India was actually not suspicious of desire. It was a central tenet of a full and complete life, which is why you had texts that described all these positions to you so that you achieved a fuller life. And again, the Kama Sutra is full of references of queer love. There are Sufi sites across the country. Many of these are now pilgrimage sites for members of the queer community, where Sufi saints who were madly in love with each other, who wrote poetry about their love and devotion to each other, which ironically now are sung by actors and actresses in Bollywood movies in very straight relationships, not realizing that their foundations actually came from very queer settings. I was going through my notes this morning and actually found a couplet that I really want to read because it's unbelievable this was written in, say, the 12th or 13th century. This is Amir Khushro writing to Nizamuddin Aulia. My blossoming youth is red with passion. How can I spend this time alone without you? Will someone please persuade Nizamuddin Aulia? For the more I coax him, the more he acts coy. I will break my bangles and throw them on my bed. I will set fire to this bodice of mine. The empty bed frightens me, and the fire of separation scorches me. And then a little later, he cheekily says, well, if he's not available, there is his brother. Mir, are there any restrictions in love? This idea of unbridled, unrestricted love in texts and scriptures and poetry speaking to us from medieval India, way before pride parades and LGBTQ activism. But what happened? I was born in this country, and my identity was a criminal offense. The identity of transgender persons was a criminal offense. An ancient community in India that's been, in fact, fighting the fight for equality in independent India, first and foremost out in the streets before anybody else in the world. Before the acronyms, before the pride parades, there was the transgender community out on the streets, and we are standing on their shoulders, the shoulders of giants in the space who've been fighting thanklessly for our equality and for our rights. And the reason why all these beautiful, rich, ancient traditions were broken was because of colonization. When the officers of the East India Company arrived on the shores of India, they were absolutely horrified by what they saw. This open profusion of desire and display of eroticism and sexuality was at odds with their ethos. And so they passed a series of laws that targeted and broke down these traditions. The most notorious and the most infamous one, of course, is Section 377. And I can see many of you nodding in the audience because this single section and the exact same language of the section was exported from the Indian penal law to multiple countries around the world. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Singapore, Trinidad and Tobago, wherever you look, because that British code was exported around the world to break deliberately by design indigenous traditions of open and inclusive sexuality. I was called for an interview on a British television show, and I said some of these things that are pretty mundane facts for us. And I went home, I was jet-lagged, and my phone exploded with angry messages from conservatives in the UK saying, get over blaming British colonization. Don't blame us for all your problems. You've been free for 75 years. We have nothing to do with this. We've moved on. But the truth is, we don't realize the persistence and the potency of some of these laws that today actually become the basis of more potent laws in many other parts of Africa and the Caribbean. And so our advocacy no longer is about universal human rights, but it's about decolonization. It's about us reclaiming a past heritage that was unfortunately broken and destroyed by centuries of colonization, which makes it our own. Which makes it less patronizing. This is not about some morality that everyone must aspire to, but this is about that past open culture and society that we had, that we are trying to find and reclaim. The second thing I think that we realized is language and representation really matter. Because the minute we filed our petitions in the Supreme Court, the government filed replies saying, oh, these are members of elite India, urban and elite English-speaking India, and this is a disease in those sections of India and not in other parts of the country. And while that's a preposterous argument, especially in a court of law, I think the government was actually showing us the mirror. Because the group of petitioners in court were, in fact, mostly members of urban elite society. Unfortunately, there isn't as much representation, whether it's in terms of class, caste, gender, income, all those intersectionalities in the movement, which actually compromises the movement itself. And again, when we started studying this, we realized that like with pre-colonial times, even pre-urban activism, there was actually rural activism happening in India before anyone in the world knew about it. Historians have documented that some of the earliest instances of queer couples were actually lesbian couples in villages in India who didn't understand what lesbian meant, who had no pride parades or pop culture to rely on. All that they felt was a deep, uncontrollable longing and desire for their partner, and just on that, fought their society to try to get married. A priest who got one of the couples married was asked, "How isn't this against Hinduism? How did you permit this?" And his simple response was, "You know, in Hinduism, you believe in rebirth, you believe in souls. Look at these two. They're fighting everything to just be with each other. This has to be a love from a previous life. Who am I to come in the way of it?" And so the earliest instances of open queer expression in the world, even in contemporary society, actually came from rural India. So who are we urban elites representing this movement? And that's why making it more representative, more diverse, actually makes the movement more resilient. The other thing that was very surprising to us was language. A Hindi news network called us, both my partner and I speak Hindi, and said, "You keep speaking to these English news channels, and that's an echo chamber. Why don't you come onto a Hindi news network?" And we thought it was a good point. And we went onto one of those networks, which is the most popular network on YouTube in India. And I have to say, both Koti and I talk about this, it's the most fulfilling thing we've done, because the day after that interview, our emails exploded with messages across rural India. People who heard us in their language and wrote to us, recorded videos coming out to us saying there's no one else we can come out to. We ran into people who said they showed that interview to their parents before coming out to them, which was unbelievable for us. The fact that just speaking in Hindi could be so much more powerful and make it so much more relatable also made us realize we were making a mistake by doing this in the English-speaking circles, as actually the government was accusing us of, and therefore language also really matters. The other thing was humanizing the cause. And I have to say, this is very difficult for us. For a lot of queer couples, you grow up in the closet. We are shy about even public display of affection. What about public display of advocacy? It just doesn't come naturally to us. And now we're supposed to go and tell our stories about how did you come out and talk about your tribulations and how did you fall in love. But fortunately, it makes a huge impact. As a lawyer, I had to detox myself from all those legal, technical arguments about this provision of the Constitution, the equality clause, due process, which meant nothing to the larger population that was watching this. And frankly, without the support of larger society, legal movements are meaningless. Law and society form a double helix, a hybrid. And that's why that kind of advocacy is really important. So we took Kotia's parents to an interview, and Kotia's mother made a heartfelt appeal to parents of other queer couples. And again, we received so much love and support for the fact that they were seeing us, our families, our parents, our siblings, that just made the whole experience much more relatable. I don't have enough time, but I wish I could show you all those queer people who are putting themselves out there at great risk, but primarily because humanizing that cause just makes it so much more powerful and effective. And the last thing that I think we learned was perseverance. Because we finally lost the case. By a 3-2 split, a narrow margin, the Supreme Court rejected our petition for marriage equality. And the next day there was rage and anger, and we felt like we were treated as second-class citizens, all completely understandable emotions. But sometimes you have to step back and look at the longer arc of history and realize how far we've come so quickly. And actually feel a sense of gratitude. So much so that, as Imran mentioned, I now have a nonprofit which builds AI solutions for those very courtrooms where we didn't get our rights, for those very judges who ruled against us. And a lot of our work involves talking to judges on a day-to-day basis who I realize are actually still looking at this as advocacy work, because advocacy doesn't always have to be active. Seeing queer people in non-queer roles and non-queer spaces in just regular day-to-day work is also empowering. And one of the judges came and told me, "I actually haven't met a queer person before." This was in rural South India. You seem just fine. Maybe they should let you get married after all." And so I think from all these experiences, my approach, especially as a lawyer to advocacy, has changed because it has to be inclusive, it has to be diverse, and it has to be representative. And it also has to be personal and human. When the judgment came out, we were obviously devastated and heartbroken. I had this secret plan that I would, after the judgment, step out of court and take Kotia to a corner and propose to him and say, those magical words, which I couldn't. And I told the story to my mom, and she was heartbroken. Everybody was crying, and she was like, you should have just done it. Why didn't you do it? I was like, maybe. So the next day, as the good Indian son that I am, I took Kotia, and we both went outside the very Supreme Court that ruled against us and got engaged to say that you may not recognize us, but we have always existed. We will continue to exist. And as Jael just said, since love is the answer, the best way of living your full, complete, unabashed life is to just keep loving each other. And that's why, because of just this journey, that longer arc of history, and the fact that I can do this today, I wish I could go back in time and tell that teenage self of mine who was so lost, so confused, so lonely, that you know what, one day you're going to grow up and not only have a love story, but have an epic love story. That kid would have been full of hope. And that's why I remain foolishly optimistic about the future of queer rights and the future of our world. Thank you so much.